15 years after I turned down a marriage proposal from a college boyfriend, I discovered he had quietly married my bitterest professional rival and fed her inside details of my business to help her destroy it. My name is Priscilla Nakamura, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. By the time I realized someone was trying to ruin me, I was already standing in the ruins. Not literal ruins, of course. My office still had the polished concrete floors I had chosen 5 years earlier, the walnut conference table that had cost more than my first car, the oversized linen pinboard covered with fabric samples and renderings and mood boards. The brass lamp over my desk still threw a warm circle of light over project folders and invoices, and the framed sketch from my first client. Everything looked intact from the outside. But 3 major clients had walked away in 6 weeks, and each one had used almost the same language to explain why. Unreliable timelines, unprofessional communication, not responsive enough. Each phrase landed like a small hammer blow because I knew my studio. I knew how obsessively we tracked deadlines. How often my manager, Beatrice, and I checked in with contractors. How many times a day I answered email because I hated leaving a client wondering where their money had gone. I knew that those complaints were not who we were. They were too polished, too consistent, too specific to be random. And when the third client ended our contract, I sat in my office alone for a long time staring at the screen, trying to decide whether I was looking at a temporary streak of bad luck or the beginning of something that could kill my business. I'm 34 years old, and I own a boutique interior design studio in Austin, Texas. I built it from one borrowed desk and a rolling rack of fabric samples into a firm that handled high-end residential projects all over the city, with a reputation for calm execution and a clean, tailored aesthetic. My clients were not just buying rooms from me, they were buying trust. They were inviting me into their homes, their schedules, their private frustrations about space and money and taste. Once that trust started to wobble, the whole business was vulnerable. I am not a woman who likes to panic first and think later. So when the third client dropped us, I did what I always did when a problem felt bigger than my own instincts. I started collecting facts. I printed every email from the lost clients. I marked up the exact phrases they had each used. I pulled our project logs, meeting notes, response times, contract milestones. I went through each account to see whether we had missed anything. We had not. In 2 cases, the client had actually been behind on decisions, and in the third, the contractor they had hired separately was the one causing delays. I was angry by the time I finished, but anger is useful only if it turns into structure. Beatrice came into my office late that Friday afternoon with 2 coffees and the expression she used when she knew I needed hard truth instead of comfort. "Tell me," she said, setting 1 cup down near my keyboard, "that this is just an unlucky month." I looked up at her. Beatrice had been with me for almost 4 years. She was the kind of manager who could keep a 6-room renovation moving while simultaneously calming a client who was furious that the handmade marble sink had a vein in the wrong shade. She had impeccable instincts for people, which made her very hard to fool. "I can't tell you that," I said. She folded her arms. "Same concerns from all 3, word for word in parts." Her face changed at that. "That's not a coincidence. No, it doesn't feel like one. Anyone come to mind?" I should have had a list. Competitors in my industry could be vicious. Austin had grown so quickly that everyone wanted the same wealthy clients, the same architects, the same award recognition, and the same magazine features. I had crossed paths with more than one designer who smiled too brightly and then copied a concept board 6 months later. But I had no obvious enemy. No one had ever seemed so threatened by my studio that they would try to poison client relationships. Then Beatrice hesitated. "There is something," she said. I leaned back in my chair. "What?" "I may be overthinking this." "Then overthink out loud." She took a breath. "Last week I saw Desmond Holloway having drinks at Lacora with Persimmon Castellano." The name hit me with enough force that I had to blink twice. Persimmon Castellano was my direct competitor. We had both been finalists for the same regional design award years ago, and ever since then our professional relationship had been a careful blend of public courtesy and private hostility. She specialized in flamboyant luxury, all dramatic shapes and expensive surfaces and maximalist statements. I did restrained, contemporary interiors with warmth and balance. We attracted similar clients but different aesthetics, which meant there was always overlap and always tension. Desmond Holloway, on the other hand, was a ghost from an entirely different life. We had dated in college. Briefly. Intensely, if you asked him, though if you asked me, I would have said we had been 2 confused 22-year-olds trying to turn a campus romance into something that could survive adulthood. He had proposed right after graduation. I had said no. That was the whole story as far as I had been concerned. I stared at Beatrice, Desmond, and Persimmon. She nodded. They were very much together, not just a business dinner. Comfortable. Familiar. He had his hand on the back of her chair at one point. Are you sure it was him? I know your ex from the few times he visited your apartment in college. Yes, I'm sure. I sat still for a moment. The problem was not that I had strong feelings about Desmond. The problem was that I did not have any feelings about him at all. That was what made his presence in this situation strange. When a person from your past resurfaces, you expect a memory to answer. Some hurt, some tenderness, some unfinished business. With Desmond, there was mostly just a blank, and then the faint annoyance of being reminded of an old and unimportant disappointment. Why would he be meeting her? I asked. Beatrice gave me a look. That is the question. I could have gone to him directly. I could have called and asked what he was doing having drinks with my enemy. But there was no evidence of anything beyond a coincidence. And I knew better than to accuse a man based on one sighting and an old breakup. If someone really was moving against me, I needed to know how. I needed something firm enough to stand on, because the moment you accuse the wrong person of sabotage, you hand them a distraction and make yourself look unstable. So I hired a private investigator. Her name was Marisol Vance, and she came recommended by a friend of mine who had used her in a complicated custody dispute involving a business owner and a secret second bank account. Marisol was in her late 40s, with cropped salt and pepper hair, a plain silver watch, and the composed, almost bored way of someone who had seen enough human stupidity to stop being surprised by it. She did not oversell herself, which I appreciated immediately. We met in a coffee shop on South Lamar, where the music was low enough to talk over, but loud enough to discourage eavesdropping. I slid a folder across the table, the 3 lost clients, the timeline, the copied language from their exit emails, and the name Desmond Halloway. Marisol flipped through the pages once, then looked up. You think this is coordinated? I think it smells coordinated. You want me to find out whether it is, and who is behind it. She nodded slowly. Any reason you think your ex is connected besides the sighting? I almost said no. Then I decided honesty would save time. We dated in college, he proposed. I turned him down. That was it. It sounded almost comedic when I said it out loud, the kind of thing people laugh about at a reunion because it happened so long ago it no longer feels real. But Marisol did not smile. She just wrote it down. And you haven't had contact since? Not meaningful contact. We ran into each other at a mutual friend's wedding 8 or 9 years ago. We exchanged pleasantries. That's all. Any reason he'd still care? I shrugged. If he does, I wouldn't know why. I barely remember the details of the breakup myself. Marisol watched me for a moment as if filing that away. People rarely forget the details of the moment they felt humiliated. I said nothing. It was the sort of sentence that sounds dramatic until life proves it practical. Her fee was not small. I paid it. For the next 3 weeks, I tried to continue working as if my business were not under threat. That turned out to be one of the hardest parts. I had to sit across from clients and discuss tile grout and pendant lighting, while wondering whether someone was already telling their neighbors not to trust me. I had to approve invoices and review renderings and pretend I was not counting every incoming email like a soldier counting supplies in a siege. Meanwhile, Marisol sent me updates by text, never more than a sentence or two. Watching Desmond. Checking Persimmon's public filings. There's more here than a social connection. I was in my office one evening after everyone else had gone home when she called instead of texting. You should sit down, she said. I looked out at the darkening street through the glass wall behind my desk. I am sitting. Good. Desmond Halloway and Persimmon Castellano are married. For a second, I thought I had misheard her. What? They married just under a year ago. Small ceremony. No public announcement. They kept it private enough that most people in your circles apparently don't know. I leaned forward, my hand tightening around the phone. That's impossible. They were just drinking together. That was part of the disguise, she said, or at least part of the normal social cover. I've confirmed the marriage through records and 2 separate sources. I stared at the paperwork on my desk and felt an odd, cold shift inside my chest. Why would he marry her? I asked, though even as I said it, I could hear how foolish the question sounded. That's what I'm trying to answer. 2 days later, she gave me the answer in fragments. Desmond had re-entered Persimmon's orbit 18 months earlier, roughly 6 months before their wedding. According to one source, a mutual acquaintance had mentioned to him that Persimmon and I had a long-running rivalry in the design world. Not just rivalry, but a bitter one, intensified by the fact that we had been finalists for the same prestigious regional award years ago and had continued to compete for the same class of clients ever since. And Desmond, Marisol said, had apparently lit up at the news. I remember sitting in my office with the blinds half open, listening to traffic on the street outside, while she explained that he had begun seeking Persimmon out after that conversation. Not because they had known each other already, not because he was following some natural path back toward love, but because he had learned that she and I disliked each other. There was a pause. "He seems to have taken that personally," Marisol said. I actually laughed then, but there was no humor in it. "Personally, we broke up when we were 22. That doesn't mean he experienced it as a 22-year-old. I turned down a proposal. That's not an attack. It was a decision. People don't always interpret decisions that way when they're the ones being refused." I let my head fall back against the chair. All at once, the whole thing became less random and more grotesque. This wasn't some rival designer independently deciding to undermine me because she thought I was a threat. This was personal. Or at least it had become personal in a way I had not anticipated. Desmond had apparently found a woman who already hated me for professional reasons and married her. Not as an accident. Not through coincidence. As if my old rejection had become an object he had stored away and polished for years until it hardened into strategy. The revelation should have made me feel vindicated. Instead, it made me feel tired. I did not know what to do with the fact that someone had carried a grudge against me for 15 years when I had barely kept the memory. That imbalance unsettled me more than if he had simply hated me openly. Open hatred is at least legible. This felt like learning you had been part of a long private story you did not know existed. Marisol kept digging. At my request, she focused on the client losses. If there was sabotage, I wanted proof of action, not just motive. That meant a legal trail, communication records, digital evidence. Marisol could gather leads, but for admissible evidence, I needed a lawyer. I hired Wilhelmina Castellano, a business tort attorney, who came highly recommended for disputes involving defamation and interference with contracts. She was in her 50s, precise in speech, with black-rimmed glasses and a way of looking at you that suggested she was already reading your entire case file in her head while you spoke. She took one look at my materials and said, "Someone is trying to create a narrative about your company." That, more than anything, clarified the situation. It wasn't enough for a competitor to be better at selling than I was. They were trying to make me appear disorganized, careless, unreliable. In the design world, where trust and referrals mattered as much as style, that sort of rumor could spread like smoke through dry grass. Wilhelmina spread the documents across her conference table and tapped the complaint language with one fingernail. "These phrases are too close," she said. "It looks coordinated, but to pursue this, I need something beyond pattern recognition. I know, any chance one of these clients had an independent issue with your studio. One had a delayed appliance shipment from a manufacturer we don't control. One was indecisive for weeks. One had an architect who changed the scope twice. None of that matches the claims they made." She nodded. "Then let's see what else we can find." Her approach was methodical. First, she requested our internal project logs, client communication records, and delivery timelines. Then she retained a digital forensics specialist named Cornelius Echebi, who had the cool, unfussy demeanor of a man more comfortable with data than drama. His job was to determine whether my former clients had been exposed to false statements through coordinated online activity or direct messages. Weeks passed. I went through the motions of work while feeling the ground beneath my business shift by degrees. I lost sleep. I stopped enjoying lunch. I jumped when my phone buzzed after hours. The worst part was not knowing how many clients had heard the rumors and not said anything. Beatrice started bringing me food and pretending not to watch me until I ate. "You're losing weight," she said one afternoon, sliding a container of soup toward me. "You say that like it's a mystery. You need to sleep. I'll put it on my to-do list." "Priscilla." I looked up. She lowered her voice. "Whoever is doing this wants you to feel isolated. Don't help them." That line stayed with me. Wilhelmina called 2 days after that with the first real break. Cornelius found something. I was in my car in the parking lot outside a tile supplier. I shut off the ignition. "Tell me." "There's an online forum. Very niche. Austin area homeowners planning renovations. Mostly people with money and no idea what they're doing. Someone has been posting for months under a pseudonym, warning other users about unreliable designers, specifically about your studio." My stomach tightened. My studio by name. Indirectly at first. Then enough details that anyone in the local market would connect it. Claims about missed deadlines, vague communication, disorganized scheduling. The themes match the complaints from your lost clients. Can they trace it? Cornelius is working on that. He has the forum's IP logs through a formal request tied to demonstrable harm. It takes time, but if the account was accessed from a consistent location, we may get something useful. I closed my eyes. Do the posts mention the clients? Not by name. But the language is clearly meant to plant doubt in the exact audience those clients belong to. That was the frightening thing. Whoever did this understood the ecosystem. They knew where my clients looked for advice. They knew how online chatter could seed suspicion without ever needing to produce a smoking gun. If someone posts enough doubt in the right place, people begin to look at you differently before they ever have a bad experience with you themselves. 3 days later, Wilhelmina came to my studio in person, which meant the news was significant enough to merit eyes and a legal pad rather than a phone call. She sat down in the conference room while Beatriz discreetly shut the door. The IP logs matched a business address, Wilhelmina said. I stared at her. Whose? Persimmon Castellano's studio. For a moment I heard nothing at all. The city traffic outside my windows seemed to vanish, and even the low hum of the air conditioner felt far away. You're certain? As certain as this sort of evidence gets. The account that made the forum post was being accessed from her office network. Beatriz made a small sound under her breath. I felt it in my hands before I felt it anywhere else. A cold, clean anger. Not explosive, not theatrical, just a steady hardening. So she did it, I said. Most likely, yes. But the remaining question is whether Desmond was involved directly or whether this was his spouse acting on her own. I thought of the drinks at Licora, the hand on her chair, the private marriage. No one built a private marriage around one grudge unless that grudge fed the whole structure. He was involved, I said. Wilhelmina studied me. What makes you say that? I told her about the old relationship, the proposal, and the fact that I had not thought of Desmond in years until this began. I said it as plainly as I could, because I had no use for self-pity or dramatics. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back. Did you ever tell him why you said no? Yes. He wanted something we were too young to promise. I wanted to finish school, get into my career, live my life. I was not cruel about it. Did he take it well? At the time, yes. Or he looked like he did. That was the part I had never worried about. In college, I had assumed we had both moved on. People break up, people get over it. Life goes forward. That is how I had always understood my own ending with him. But now I was being told that he had instead been collecting the ending like a debt. Wilhelmina tapped a pen against the table. If he gave Persimmon personal information about your operation, that strengthens the interference claim. We need a source. Someone who can confirm Desmond passed along details. Marisol provided the next piece through a source in Persimmon's studio. It took another week and a promise of confidentiality, but eventually she came back with a summary so specific, it made the whole thing feel even dirtier. Desmond had not just been a passive husband in the background. He had supplied Persimmon with details about my project schedules, my preferred communication methods, the timing of client meetings, and the cadence of my studio's workflow. Enough to make her forum posts sound like insider observations. Enough to make prospective clients believe she was warning them from a place of experience rather than spite. When Marisol told me that, I sat very still. How would he know any of that? I asked. From you, she said, and from the time he knew you. People remember patterns. He may have pulled from old knowledge and made it seem current. 15 years old? Old knowledge can still be useful if the target doesn't know they're being watched. I rubbed my forehead. I wanted to reject the idea that some college boyfriend I had forgotten could possibly still know enough about me to help destroy my business. But the facts were piling into place with sickening consistency. He had learned that Persimmon and I were rivals. He had married her. He had fed her personal context. She had been the one posting online and poisoning my client pool. He had made my rejection the origin point of a scheme that now had real financial consequences. I said, "This is insane." Marisol's voice stayed level. "It is, but it's also organized." That night I did not go home right away. I stayed in the studio after everyone else left and walked through the rooms as if seeing them for the first time. The fabric samples were still in neat labeled stacks. The drafting table in the corner still held an unfinished millwork sketch for a client in Westlake. The shelves of books and material binders looked as orderly as they always had, but for the first time in years I noticed how much of the business existed on trust that was invisible, until someone tried to fracture it. I thought about the 3 clients who had left. One had called from a luxury condo overlooking Ladybird Lake, apologizing in the clipped, embarrassed tone people use when they think they might be making an unfortunate decision, but do not want to admit they are being influenced. Another had written a cool, formal email that read like it had been vetted by someone else. The third had seemed genuinely unsettled, which was the one that hurt most, because that meant the rumor had not just touched the edge of the relationship. It had entered the room. The next morning I began calling people I trusted in the industry, not to complain, but to quietly reassert my own reality. I spoke to an architect I had worked with on a modern farmhouse in Rollingwood. I spoke to a contractor who had seen enough real delays to recognize invented ones. I spoke to a former client who told me, with more loyalty than I deserved, that if anyone questioned my professionalism, they clearly had never had to survive one of my weekly status updates. Those calls helped more than I expected. They reminded me that a reputation is not just a fragile surface, it is a network of remembered experiences. One person can bruise it, but they cannot erase it alone. Wilhelmina moved fast after that. She prepared the complaint, anchoring it in tortious interference with business relationships and defamation. The legal language mattered. It translated the mess of my life into claims the court could process. False statements, demonstrable loss, coordinated conduct, intent. Cornelius's forensic report and Marisol's corroborated trail gave her enough to file with confidence. She warned me not to make direct contact with either of them before service. "Let the papers do the talking," she said. "If they know they're under scrutiny, they may start destroying things, coordinating stories, or shifting blame." I obeyed. The service itself happened on a Tuesday morning. I was in a client presentation when Beatrice knocked once and stepped inside with her phone in hand. Her expression told me everything before she said anything. They've been served. My client, a woman renovating a historic house in Travis Heights, looked between us awkwardly. I put on a smile and finished the presentation before walking back to my office with my pulse roaring in my ears. In the hour that followed, I received 3 separate emails from colleagues who had somehow already heard that something was happening. None of them asked for details. They simply said they were sorry, and that they were still happy to refer work my way. That small kindness steadied me more than I wanted to admit. I had spent weeks imagining the worst-case version of professional isolation, and instead I was getting quiet evidence that I had not been abandoned. What I wanted, irrationally, was for my phone to ring immediately, for Desmond to call and say there had been some misunderstanding, for Persimmon to angrily deny everything but accidentally reveal something useful, for the whole thing to erupt so I would not have to continue existing in a state of dreadful anticipation. Instead, there was silence. Silence, then attorneys. Persimmon's lawyer contacted Wilhelmina first, claiming the forum posts were opinion, not fact. In the abstract, that defense can work, because people are allowed to express judgments about professional services. But as soon as Wilhelmina pushed the records over, the weakness in that argument became obvious. The posts had not said, "I didn't like this designer's style." They had claimed specific failures, missed deadlines, poor communication, disorganization, and those claims were false. My studio records showed the opposite. We had delivered on schedule in the relevant projects. We had emails proving prompt replies. We had change order logs that showed exactly which delays were client-driven or vendor-driven. It was not a close call. Desmond's lawyer tried a different angle. He said my ex had merely had a casual conversation about an old acquaintance's business and had not intended any harm. That argument died the moment the source from Persimmon's studio confirmed how specific his guidance had been. He had not been vaguely discussing me. He had given her exact enough information to sharpen the attacks. He had helped shape the lies so they would sound credible. I never saw either of them during the months of legal back and forth, but I heard enough to know the case was making them both uncomfortable. Pressure changes people. It strips away the fiction that nobody will ever hold them accountable. I expected vindication to feel better than it did. It did feel good for a moment to know the evidence was solid. It felt good to know I was not imagining the pattern. It felt good to know I had trusted my own instincts instead of dismissing them, but none of that made the damage disappear. My clients were still gone. My reputation had still taken a hit. I still had staff to reassure and business to stabilize and a financial model that had to survive several more months before the pipeline recovered. There were also smaller consequences that never make it into court filings but matter all the same. A vendor who had been slow to return one of my calls became even slower after hearing a rumor. An assistant designer asked me twice whether she should be worried about her portfolio being associated with us. I had to sit with both of them and explain, as calmly as I could, that we were fine, that the work was strong, and that I would not let a lie define the studio. Saying it out loud helped me believe it a little more. And beneath all of that was the stranger feeling, the one I never said out loud. Someone had remembered me incorrectly for 15 years. Not as I was, but as a wound. That knowledge was hard to reconcile with my own life because my life had continued without interruption. I had dated other people, built a company, bought a home, made mistakes, had successes, revised my priorities. I had become a person with actual obligations and concerns and joys that had nothing to do with being proposed to by a college boyfriend. But in Desmond's version of history, I had apparently remained frozen at the point of refusal, as if my entire existence had been reduced to one no. I told Beatrice one evening, after everyone had left, "I don't understand how someone can hold on to something like that." She was standing by the shelves, straightening sample books that were already straight. "You don't have to understand it," she said. "You just have to protect yourself from it." That was useful advice, and not just for the case. The legal process dragged on for months. During that time, I had to keep my studio functioning while every client rumor felt magnified. I became more careful with access, more cautious about what information circulated outside the office, more deliberate about documenting every decision. We tightened passwords, revised communication protocols, and stopped discussing client schedules in any place that could be overheard by visitors. It was boring work, administrative work, but it made me feel less exposed. Marisol checked in occasionally, mostly to say there had been no new attempts to meddle with the forum posts or shift the online narrative. Whoever was behind it had likely realized they had been caught. One afternoon, she called with a final piece of background that changed the emotional shape of the whole story, even if it did not change the legal one. "I found out when he started telling people you had rejected him," she said. "What do you mean? He didn't talk about it much at first. But after he got serious with Persimmon, he apparently started framing your old relationship as a betrayal, not just a breakup, a humiliation." I closed my eyes. There it was again, the word that explained so much of his behavior without excusing any of it. Humiliation, I asked. Did he say I'd done something wrong? According to the source, yes. He spoke as if you'd made him look foolish. That stung in a way I did not expect. I had not been cruel to him, I had been honest. But honesty and injury often look the same to the person on the receiving end when their expectations are not met. That is one of the uglier lessons adulthood keeps teaching. I said, "I barely remember the conversation." He clearly did. There was no triumph in that, just sadness, really. Sadness and a bit of disbelief that a person could choose to spend 15 years keeping a tiny old humiliation alive until it metastasized into an expensive, self-destructive conspiracy. I started thinking then about all the ordinary ways people carry private versions of the same event. One person remembers a breakup as relief. Another remembers it as rejection. One person files a failed friendship under maturity, the other files it under betrayal. Most of the time, those mismatched memories never matter because people drift apart and stop trying to force their story onto one another. But every once in a while, someone refuses to let the story end, and then the mismatch becomes dangerous. When settlement talks finally began in earnest, Wilhelmina prepared me for the shape of them. "They want to avoid trial," she said. "That's good. Trial creates a public record and more exposure. But don't mistake a settlement for remorse. I won't. The question is how much they're willing to pay to make this go away." As it turned out, quite a bit. The settlement came 9 months after the initial filing, after months of negotiation, exchanges over wording, and a painful amount of lawyerly patience. Persimmon and Desmond agreed to cover my studio's documented lost revenue from the 3 contracts. They issued a formal written retraction on the same forum where the false statements had been posted. And they accepted a permanent injunction preventing either of them from making further public statements about my business. That should have felt like the end. Legally, it was close enough. Emotionally, it was not. The first time I saw the retraction, I read it twice because it looked so thin compared to the scale of the harm. A few sober sentences on a page cannot hold up against months of whispered suspicion, lost opportunities, and the slow ache of wondering who believes the worst version of you. Still, I kept a copy. Not because it satisfied me, but because it proved that the accusation had not survived scrutiny. No amount of money could restore the momentum my studio had lost during those months, or the trust I had spent years building in Austin's design community. Reputations recover slowly. They rebuild through projects, consistency, and time. The settlement gave me breathing room, not closure. I did not contact Desmond directly once the legal process was over. I had no desire to hear his explanation, because I did not believe any explanation could justify what he had done. If he had carried a hurt for 15 years, that was his burden to manage. It did not become my fault, because he lacked the tools to process it. He could call it humiliation, betrayal, youthful foolishness, or whatever else made him feel less responsible. The result was the same. He had weaponized a memory I barely retained. Persimmon I understood slightly better, which is not the same as forgiving her. She had real professional reasons to dislike me. We had competed for the same awards, the same clients, and at times, the same attention from architects and developers who only wanted one designer for a project. I had never asked for her friendship, and she had never pretended to offer it. But personal rivalry becomes something uglier when it is fed by someone else's resentment. She did not invent the grudge. She chose to amplify it. I kept a folder with all the case documents in a file cabinet behind my desk. It is an ugly little archive. Legal correspondence, printouts of the forum posts, summaries of communications, copies of the settlement agreement. I do not look at it often, but I do sometimes pull it out when I need a reminder that the facts existed even when the emotional logic did not. One night, long after the dust had settled, Beatriz and I were the last two people in the studio. The lamps were dimmed, the sample shelves were in shadow. Outside, Austin traffic moved past in a blur of headlights. She glanced at the file cabinet and said, "You still keep that?" "Yes." "Why?" I considered the question. "Because it's hard to believe," I said. "And because I need proof that it happened the way I remember it." She nodded once, as if that made perfect sense. My studio did recover, slowly, then more steadily. Some clients heard a version of the story through the neighborhood grapevine and reached out to say they had never doubted me. Others simply came back because the work remained strong. One architect I had worried about losing told me, over coffee, that the people who survive this industry are usually the ones who stay calm while everyone else rushes to narrate the chaos. I took that as a compliment. 2 years later, the business is stable again. Better than stable, in some ways. The team is tighter, the systems are better. I am more careful about who gets what information, and I no longer assume that a long-past relationship has gone quiet simply because time has passed. That was the lesson I did not know I needed. What still troubles me is not the sabotage itself, although that was bad enough. It is the strange asymmetry of memory. I had lived through the end of that college relationship as a small, ordinary event. He had apparently experienced it as the beginning of an unfinished story. Those two realities sat side by side for 15 years, and I had no idea mine was being stored inside someone else as a grievance. People like to say the past is past, but that is only true if everyone agrees to leave it there. Desmond did not. And because he did not, I had to learn a painful truth. The version of yourself you leave behind in someone else's mind can become dangerous if they decide to build a future around it. I don't know whether he thinks of me now. I don't know whether he and Persimmon still have a marriage that can withstand the kind of foundation they built under it. I suspect there are things in that relationship I will never fully see, and I have made peace with that. Not everything needs to be understood to be finished. What I do know is this: I am still here. My studio is still here. The clients who matter know the work we do and the way we do it. And when I look at the folder in my cabinet, I no longer see just an old betrayal or a legal case or a bizarre collision of people from different eras of my life. I see a warning. Not that love goes wrong, or even that rejection can curdle into obsession. I already knew humans could be strange and petty and wounded. The warning is simpler and in some ways more useful. Never assume that because you moved on. Everyone else did too. And never mistake being forgotten for being harmless.